The Japanese soldier who kept fighting WW2 for 29 years because nobody told him it was over. In February of 1974, a 52-year-old man walked out of a jungle in the Philippines carrying a working rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and a sword that had belonged to his father. He was wearing a uniform that he had patched and repaired so many times over the previous 29 years that almost nothing of the original fabric remained. He was lean and hard and completely alert in the way that men become alert when alertness is the difference between living and dying, and he had been that alert every day for nearly 3 decades. His name was Hiroo Onoda. He was a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army, and he believed with complete and total certainty on the day he walked out of that jungle that the Second World War was still being fought and that he was still fighting it. He was wrong. The war had ended in August of 1945, 29 years and 6 months before the moment he stepped out of the trees and onto the path where a young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki was waiting for him. Japan had surrendered. The empire he had sworn to serve had ceased to exist before most of the people alive in 1974 had been born. The world he had last seen as a young officer in 1945 had been remade completely twice in the time he spent in the jungle, and Hiroo Onoda had known none of it. He had not known it because nobody had told him in a way he could believe, and he could not believe it because he had been trained at the deepest level at which a man can be trained, that the mission did not end until you received orders to end it, and the orders had never come. This is the story of what loyalty costs when the thing you are loyal to no longer exists. It is one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking stories of the 20th century, and it begins not in a jungle, but in a classroom, with a young man who believed everything he was taught. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in Kamikawa, a small town in Wakayama Prefecture on the western coast of Honshu, the main island of Japan. He was the third of 7 children in a family that valued discipline and education and the kind of structured moral seriousness that was inseparable in Japan in the 1920s and 30s from loyalty to the emperor and belief in Japan's imperial mission. His father was a school teacher, a man of precise habits and high expectations who raised his children to understand that duty was not optional and that the individual existed in service to something larger than himself. This was not unusual in Japan in that era. It was the water everyone swam in, the air everyone breathed, and it was reinforced by the school system and the culture and the slow build of militarism that was reshaping Japanese society through the 1930s into something that would eventually lead the country into a war it could not win. Onoda was a serious student, physically capable, the kind of young man who attracted the attention of institutions that were looking for exactly his qualities. He worked briefly for a trading company in China in his late teens, which gave him experience of the world outside Japan and a practical understanding of how to operate in foreign environments. In December of 1942, at age 20, he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He was not an unwilling soldier. He believed in what the army represented, and he threw himself into his training with the wholehearted commitment of a young man who has found the place where his values and his abilities align completely. He was selected for officer training and then, in 1944, for something rarer and more demanding. He was selected for training at the Futamata branch of the Nakano School, which was the Imperial Japanese Army's school for intelligence and guerrilla warfare, the Japanese equivalent of what other armies might call special operations. The Nakano School did not train men to follow orders in the conventional sense. It trained men to operate independently behind enemy lines without support for extended periods using whatever resources the environment provided. It trained men to resist capture, to resist propaganda, to treat any information from the enemy as potentially false, and to continue the mission regardless of what they saw or heard or were told by anyone who was not their direct commanding officer. The training was thorough, it was effective, and it would shape every decision Hiroo Onoda made for the next 30 years in ways that the men who designed the training had never imagined, because they had designed it for a war they expected to win, and they had not considered what it would do to a man if they lost. He arrived on the island of Lubang in the Philippines in December of 1944. He was a second lieutenant, 22 years old, and his orders were to lead a guerrilla resistance on the island in the event of an American invasion. The orders were explicit on one point above all others. He was not to surrender. He was not to take his own life. He was to continue fighting until he received direct orders from his commanding officer to stop. Those orders came from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, and Onoda understood them with the absolute clarity of a man who has been trained to understand orders as the fixed points around which everything else must be organized. He was on Lubang when the Americans landed in February of 1945. The Japanese garrison was overwhelmed. Most of the Japanese soldiers on the island were killed or surrendered. Onoda and 3 other soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Private First Class Shoichi Shimada, and Corporal Kinshichi Kozuka, retreated into the jungle and began the guerrilla campaign they had been ordered to conduct. They had their weapons, their training, their orders, and each other. They did not have a radio. They did not have any way of receiving communications from outside the island. And on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio in Japan and told his people that the war was over, that Japan had accepted the terms of unconditional surrender, Hiroo Onoda was in the jungle on Lubang and heard nothing. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to be a man of 23 in a jungle on a Philippine island with 3 companions and a mission, and no way of knowing that the thing you are fighting for has ceased to exist. The war ended and the world moved on, and Hiroo Onoda stayed in place because his orders said stay in place, because his training said treat enemy information as propaganda, because the leaflets that were dropped on Lubang in late 1945 telling Japanese soldiers the war was over were exactly the kind of thing his training had told him the enemy would do to try to make Japanese soldiers surrender. He read the leaflets. He discussed them with his 3 companions. They agreed that the leaflets were almost certainly a trick. They stayed in the jungle. In 1946, family letters were dropped on the island. Letters from the families of the soldiers urging them to come home, that the war was over, that Japan was rebuilding. Onoda read his letter. He understood that it was either genuine or that the Americans were sophisticated enough to forge family correspondence as a psychological operation. His training had told him that the enemy was capable of sophisticated deception. He could not know which this was. He stayed in the jungle. This is the point in the story where some people will say that he should have known, that the evidence was overwhelming, that a reasonable man would have concluded that the war had ended. But Hiroo Onoda was not operating as a civilian trying to assess competing information sources. He was operating as a Nakano-trained intelligence officer who had been explicitly conditioned to treat exactly this kind of information as enemy deception, and who had orders that said the mission continued until he received direct orders from his commanding officer to stop. The orders were the fixed point. Everything else was variable. Everything else could be false. The orders could not be false because the orders came from inside the chain of command, and nothing outside the chain of command could override them. This was not irrationality. It was a rigidly rational application of the training he had received, applied to a situation his trainers had never imagined, producing a result that would consume the next 3 decades of his life. 1947, 1948, 1949. The years passed in the jungle, and the 4 men maintained their discipline and their mission. They raided local farms for food. They engaged Philippine military patrols that they believed were enemy forces. People died in these engagements. Filipino civilians and police and soldiers who were not fighting a war that had ended 4 years earlier, but who encountered men in the jungle who believed they were. This is the part of the story that carries its own grief, separate from the grief of Onoda's situation. The grief of the people on Lubang who lived with the consequences of a war that would not end because 4 men in the jungle did not know it had. In 1950, Private Yuichi Akatsu separated from the group and eventually surrendered to Philippine forces. He was the first crack in the small world the 4 men had built in the jungle. For Onoda, it was a defection, a failure of commitment, not evidence that the war was over. He had been trained that some men broke under pressure and that the breaking of one man was not a reason for the others to follow. He stayed. In 1954, Private First Class Shoichi Shimada was killed in a firefight with Philippine troops on the beach at Gontan. Onoda and Kozuka buried him. They were 2 now, in a jungle that had been their entire world for 9 years, fighting a war that the rest of the world was not fighting, maintaining a discipline and a purpose that had long since ceased to have any strategic meaning, but that was the only thing that gave their existence structure. 1955, 1960, 1965. Japan rebuilt itself from the rubble of defeat and became an economic miracle. The men who had fought the war went home and raised families and watched their country transform with a speed that seemed impossible. Onoda's parents aged. His brothers and sisters married, had children, built lives. And Hiroo Onoda was in the jungle on Lubang, maintaining his rifle, rationing his ammunition, watching the jungle paths for enemy patrols, waiting for orders that were not coming because the man who was supposed to give them had long since been demobilized and was living a civilian life in Japan and had not been told that Onoda was still out there. 1972. Corporal Kinshichi Kozuka was killed in a firefight with Philippine police near Imok. He was shot twice and died quickly, and Onoda buried him alone in the jungle where they had lived together for 27 years. He was 50 years old, and he was alone. He had outlasted his companions, outlasted the searches, outlasted what most men would have considered the last reasonable limit of endurance. He was alone in the jungle with his rifle and his orders, and the absolute certainty that the mission required him to continue. Think about that aloneness for a moment. Not the aloneness of a weekend in the woods. Not the aloneness of a hard month or a difficult year. 27 years of jungle, of rationing food and ammunition, of sleeping in rotation to maintain watch, of speaking only to the men who shared the mission, and now even they were gone. The Philippine government knew he was out there. They had conducted searches. They had sent former Japanese soldiers into the jungle with loudspeakers calling his name, telling him the war was over, urging him to come out. He had observed these operations from hiding and concluded they were enemy psychological operations designed to flush him out of cover. His training had been too good. Every piece of evidence that the war had ended was also, in his framework, exactly the kind of evidence the enemy would manufacture to make him believe the war had ended. He could not be fooled because he could not be reached. And he could not be reached because the one thing that could reach him, a direct order from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had never come. In 1974, a 23-year-old Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki decided to go looking for Hiroo Onoda. Suzuki was exactly the kind of young man that the 1970s produced in Japan, a country that had rebuilt itself so completely and so fast that an entire generation had grown up with no direct experience of what the war had cost, and who approached the legend of the soldier still fighting in the jungle on Lubang with the same spirit of adventure with which he might have approached any difficult wilderness challenge. He went to the Philippines. He went to Lubang. He went into the jungle with enough supplies and enough patience to wait, and he called Onoda's name, and he waited. Onoda found him first, because Onoda was better at the jungle than anyone who had not spent 29 years in it. He observed Suzuki from cover for long enough to determine that this young man was alone and was not a military operation, and then he made contact. What followed was one of the most extraordinary conversations of the 20th century. Two Japanese men in a Philippine jungle, one of them 23 years old and alive in the world of 1974, the other 52 years old and alive in a world that had ended before the younger man was born. Suzuki told Onoda that the war was over. Onoda said he knew this was what people said, but that he required orders from his commanding officer before he could accept it. Suzuki asked who his commanding officer was. Onoda told him. Suzuki went back to Japan and found Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who was retired and working at a bookstore in Tokyo, and he told Taniguchi that Hiroo Onoda was alive and armed and waiting for orders in the jungle on Lubang, and Taniguchi's response to this information is not recorded in any document that has been made public. But the result of it is that Taniguchi traveled to the Philippines in February of 1974, walked into the jungle on Lubang, and found Hiroo Onoda. The meeting happened on March 9th, 1974. Onoda came out of cover when he recognized Taniguchi. He was wearing his patched uniform. He was carrying his rifle, his ammunition, his grenades, and his father's sword. He saluted. Taniguchi returned the salute. Then Taniguchi read him the order. The order said that in accordance with the Imperial General Headquarters announcement of the 15th of August, 1945, all combat activity was to cease and all units were to surrender their weapons to the nearest Allied commanders. Onoda stood at attention and listened to the order. He had followed every order his commanding officer had ever given him with complete and total fidelity. He had maintained the mission through 29 years of jungle, through the deaths of all three of his companions, through every search and every leaflet drop and every loudspeaker broadcast, and every attempt by the Philippine government and the Japanese government and individual Japanese citizens to reach him. He had been faithful to the order to continue in a way that no military institution in history had the right to expect of any man. And now the order to stop had finally come, from the mouth of the man who had the authority to give it, and Hiroo Onoda obeyed it. He laid down his rifle. He removed his ammunition. He placed his grenades on the ground. He held his father's sword, and he didn't want to give it up because it was the one thing he had that connected him to the world before the jungle, and Taniguchi told him to keep it, and he did. He walked out of the jungle on March 11th, 1974. He was 52 years old. He had entered the jungle as a 22-year-old second lieutenant in an empire that no longer existed. He came out into a world that had been remade so completely that almost nothing in it corresponded to anything he remembered. Japan was not the Japan he had left. The Philippines were not the Philippines he had been sent to defend against. The war was not a living thing that men were fighting. It was history. It was something that had happened to other people in a time that was receding further into the past every year, and the man who had spent that entire time living inside it walked out into the sunshine and faced the cameras of the international press and stood very straight and didn't show on his face whatever it was he felt in that moment, because he had been trained not to show what he felt, and 29 years of jungle had made that training into something deeper than habit. The Philippine government had issued a warrant for Onoda's arrest in connection with the deaths that had occurred during his decades of guerrilla activity. President Ferdinand Marcos pardoned him, citing the extraordinary circumstances of his situation. Onoda returned to Japan in March of 1974, and the Japan he returned to received him with a complexity of feeling that the country had rarely been asked to feel about anything. He was a hero to some, a symbol of the loyalty and discipline that had once been considered the highest Japanese virtues. He was an anachronism to others, a relic of a belief system that had led Japan into catastrophe and that the country had spent 30 years trying to move beyond. He was, to almost everyone who thought carefully about what had happened to him, something that defied easy categorization. A man who had been so faithfully what his country had trained him to be that he had continued to be it long after his country had decided to be something else, and the question of what that cost him, what it cost the people on Lubang who had lived alongside his war without choosing it, and what it meant about the institutions that had made him, was a question that did not have a comfortable answer. He found Japan overwhelming. The crowds, the noise, the technology, the pace of a country that had rebuilt itself from rubble into one of the most prosperous societies on Earth in the time he had been in the jungle. He had missed 30 years of ordinary life. He had missed his parents' deaths. His father had died in 1959, his mother in 1966, and he had been alive and in the jungle for both of those deaths, unable to know about them, unable to mourn them in the presence of anyone who shared the loss. He had missed the marriages of his siblings, the births of his nieces and nephews, 30 years of meals and seasons and the accumulated small moments that constitute a life. He could not get it back. That was the thing nobody talked about directly in the coverage of his return, the thing that was true and that had no remedy. He could not get it back. He moved to Brazil in 1975, where his brother had emigrated years earlier, and he raised cattle there and built a life that was quieter than Japan and that gave him space to reconstruct himself on his own terms. He married a Japanese-Brazilian woman named Hiroo Onoda in 1976. He was 54 years old and she was 46, and what they built together in the years that followed was the ordinary life he hadn't been able to have in the jungle, the life of a man and a woman in a house with meals and seasons and the accumulation of small moments. And it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. He returned to Japan in 1984 and established a nature school for young people in Fukushima Prefecture, a school that taught wilderness skills and self-reliance and the kind of practical relationship with the natural world that he had developed over 30 years in the Philippine jungle. He called it the Onoda Nature School, and he ran it with the same disciplined attention he had brought to everything in his life. And the young people who came through it learned things from him that they couldn't have learned anywhere else, because the man teaching them had lived inside the wilderness in a way that no instructor with a certificate and a classroom could fully approximate. He was asked about the Philippines many times in the years after his return, in interviews and in the memoir he wrote called No Surrender, which was published in Japan in 1974 and translated into multiple languages. He answered the questions with the precision and honesty of a man who had spent a long time thinking about what had happened to him and who had reached conclusions that were not simple. He said he didn't regret his loyalty. He said that if he had known the truth, he would have come out of the jungle earlier, which is perhaps the most self-evident statement any man has ever made. He said he believed that the young people of Japan had lost something important when they lost the sense of duty and commitment that had animated his generation, which is a complicated thing to believe when the sense of duty and commitment he was describing had kept him in a jungle for 29 years, fighting a war that had ended before the people he was talking to were born. He died on January 16, 2014, at 91 years old in a hospital in Tokyo. He had outlived most of his generation by the margin that the jungle had preserved him. 30 years of hard living that had made his body into something that civilian life could not easily break down. His obituary ran in newspapers around the world. Everyone knew his name by then. Everyone knew the story. But knowing the story and understanding what it means are different things. And the thing it means is not simple. Here is what Hiroo Onoda's story means. It means that a man can be so thoroughly shaped by the institution that forms him that the institution's purposes survive inside him long after the institution itself has ceased to exist. It means that loyalty, which is one of the highest things a person can offer another person or a cause, can become a kind of prison when the thing you are loyal to is gone and nobody tells you it is gone. It means that the training we receive about what to trust and what to disbelieve can be so deep that even overwhelming evidence cannot penetrate it, not because we are stupid, but because the training was designed to resist exactly that kind of penetration. And it means something personal and specific and almost unbearable, which is that 30 years of ordinary life, 30 years of meals and seasons and the presence of people who loved you is something that can be taken from a man not by his enemies, but by the silence of the institution that sent him out and then forgot to bring him home. Major Taniguchi was demobilized in 1945. He was told to cease operations. He was not told that Hiroo Onoda was still in the jungle on Lubang waiting for orders. He did not know. The institution that had sent Onoda to Lubang with orders to fight until ordered to stop did not have a system for making sure the order to stop reached every man it had sent out. Hiroo Onoda was 22 years old when he went into that jungle. He was 52 when he came out. The institution that put him there owed him those 30 years and had no way to give them back. And the man who finally walked out of the trees and laid down his rifle did not ask for them back because he had been trained not to ask for things that could not be given. He had been trained to complete the mission. He had been trained to wait for orders. He had done both for 29 years with a fidelity that the institution that demanded it could not have matched if the situation had been reversed. That is the thing about Hiroo Onoda that stays with you after the story is over. Not the jungle, not the rifle, not the 29 years. The fidelity. The absolute, costly, irreplaceable fidelity of a man who believed what he had been taught to believe and acted on it every single day until the day someone finally came and told him the truth. He deserved to be told the truth a long time before 1974. Every day he spent in that jungle after August 15th, 1945, was a day the institution that made him owed him and never paid. He never said that. He was not the kind of man who said things like that. But we can say it for him 30 years after his death, because the least we can do for a man who gave everything he had to a cause that had already ended is to tell his story accurately and completely, and to say plainly what it cost him, and to mean it when we say that he deserved better than the silence that kept him in the jungle while the world moved on without him.